Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Phoenix Smith, and I am your facilitator for today and the founder of a new project. We're not really an organization yet, but we're a project called the Alliance for Ecotherapy and Social Justice. Before we get started today, I would like for us to take a moment to just ground and breathe in a moment of silence. I want to specifically ask that we take a moment to remember and honor the hundreds of Indigenous children that were found buried in Canada. I would also like us to take a moment to honor our blood ancestors and pray for their elevation and our elevation through our breathing. I also want to take a moment in time to honor all of the members of our living family, our human family that support us and allow us to be here today, whether that is through watching our children, taking over our work duties, helping us to pay our rent, loving us and supporting us, to thank those that love us. I also want us to take a moment in time to thank all of our elders who have taught us in the different ways so that we could do our best to be human and be here. And I also want us to take a moment as we're breathing in to thank our non-human kin, our animals, the spirits of nature, the rivers, the mountains, the earth. So if we could just take a few moments to just breathe in and give thanks and remember, I would appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate you. So today I am very humbled and very grateful to facilitate this conversation. I created the Alliance for Ecotherapy last year, but I have been a practicing ecotherapist since 2011. I come to ecotherapy with 25 years plus experience in public health as a social worker and a leader, working primarily in the field of chronic disease and health justice and social justice. I also come to this work as a person who is queer identified, Black identified, living here on a loaning land in Oakland. I come to this work as a person who has been on a path of devotion in the African spiritual tradition and was initiated in 2008 in Lukumi, the Afro-Cuban lineage of the Orisha tradition. I also come to this as a Black person that lives in East Oakland, that is a community that's highly impacted by environmental toxins, highly impacted by police violence and poverty. I live here in this community. And I come here as a person that understands that anytime we talk about issues of social justice, that it can, I don't really like the word trigger, but it can bring up uncomfortable conversations and discomfort within our own bodies and our minds and our spirits. And I want to invite you to what we are calling brave space. We can't guarantee that this space is safe, but we will ask you and invite you into a space to where we can all show up at the best way that we can. So knowing that we are all imperfect, we're all learning. This is not a place where we want people to be or talk or say certain buzzwords. We know that these conversations may be challenging. So we ask that you just take a breath and check yourself and take care of yourself. We ask that we exercise some grace with each other as we move through this process. We ask that I also invite you to, if you're a person that is used to speaking up, I ask that you take a step back. And if you're a person that is maybe perhaps a little shy around speaking up, especially around issues of social justice, I ask that you take a step forward, either speaking on camera or in the chat. So this is an invitation to Brave Space. And I ask that I'm inviting you into Brave Space. And I would ask now, if you will accept my invitation into this Brave Space, can you please indicate some way, either by saying yes, a thumbs up, typing yes into the chat? We would greatly appreciate that. All right, thank you so much. Please note that we have a wonderful group of volunteers that helped put this together that I'm so, so grateful for. We had many meetings to put this together. And I want to give a shout out to Jeanette, to Alex, to Marisha, to Julie, and to our tech assistant. You can see in her name, Alicia, who is here to help you through the Zoom world. If something happens, please send her a message where you need some help with something, and she is here to help through that process. I also want to say that this is our first time trying to make a meeting accessible to people who have disabilities. And in that regard, please know the meeting is being recorded. Please also know that closed captions is also on. We also ask that if you speak, just please try to speak slowly and clearly so that the closed captions can catch what you're speaking, what you're saying. And if someone can volunteer in the community to watch the closed caption, and when you see words that might be misspelled or confused, you can just type the correction in the chat. Can someone in the community do that for us? Does anyone have experience or willingness to do that? All right, we'll continue moving forward, but just know that with closed captions, it's not perfect closed caption, but we're using it for the first time. Also, for the panelists and other people, if you do decide to speak on camera, if you can remember, we ask that you please just describe yourself. So for example, I say, you know, I'm a light-skinned Black person with short salt and pepper hair, glasses, and a white shirt. So we know that this is a process, a learning process for us. So we're not asking people to be perfect around it, but we're just asking you to raise your consciousness today around access. Also, please take care of yourself, turn your camera off, lie down, whatever, drink water, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. So thank you very much. So when I was thinking about people to invite to be panelists, I didn't know, honestly. My experience in this field has been very interesting. For a long time, I was one of few Black people that were kind of in the weeds with eco-psychologists and ecotherapists around this work. And I've had very interesting experiences. I've experienced a lot of microaggressions and just plain fear from white people that are practicing this. We know that the majority of people that call themselves ecotherapists, eco-psychologists, nature therapists, forest therapists in the United States and in other countries identify as white settlers, white people. And sometimes I've had a lot of bumps along the way. But I've also had a lot of support and made a lot of good friendships, including Linda Bazell, who's a well-known ecotherapist, is on our advisory council, and other people who have a lot more experience than I. So I wanted to contact people that I knew had experience in the field and then were actually practicing ecotherapists, not teaching it, not writing about it, but in the streets with the people doing the work. So the first person I would like to introduce, who I was so happy when we found each other, I called him a unicorn several times. Dr. Clifton Hicks is a licensed social worker and a PhD. And so I will let Dr. Hicks introduce himself.
Thank you, Phoenix. That's a very generous introduction. I'm Dr. Clifton Hicks. I'm wearing a white cap. I also have light brown skin, salt and pepper facial hair, mostly salt at this point. Wearing a white shirt, and I'm sitting out on my porch on the southern coast of Boston, on the eastern seaboard of the United States. My Earth story originated here in Boston, even though I live and work in the San Francisco Bay Area. I grew up in inner city Boston in the housing development. And as a child, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to the country in New Hampshire for the summer. And there, I guess I found ecotherapy. We certainly didn't call it back then in the late 60s, early 70s, excuse me. But it seemed to be a very special place, far removed from the goings on in inner city Boston at the time. That was, like many cities in our country, very stressful, particularly for people of color. In the community I found and the activities I engaged in New Hampshire, including mountain climbing and canoeing and swimming and hiking, just seemed to be a very natural thing for me to do. So I came to this work through that experience, and over the last 10 years, I created Urban-Based Adventures. I'm the founder and executive director, where I combine psychotherapy with outdoor rock climbing to treat trauma and adverse childhood experiences with children and youth in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's my story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hicks. Appreciate you. So next, I want to introduce Musenge, who we've gotten to know each other over the past year during the pandemic, and I'm very grateful that we have been able to connect. And so I will let you, one of the things that stood out for me about Musenge is she uses different modalities, not only ecotherapy in her practice, but she also practices in the South. And she just has a very strong presence around the work. And I was just very grateful that she could be with us here today. So Musenge.
Thank you, Phoenix, and thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here with all of you. I am currently on the land of Cherokee and Shawanaki people in Nashville, Tennessee. And my Earth story began in my home country of Zambia. Had a very connected relationship with nature that was encouraged by my parents. But mostly I went to a school that was utilizing the British curriculum, as Zambia is a former British colony. And there wasn't a lot of space for me in that curriculum as a neurodivergent Black girl. And so nature became a place where I could regulate myself and feel welcome and accepted in my process. So naturally, I use a lot of the modalities that have been a part of my healing journey with my clients, and that includes internal family systems and Hakomi and a lot of body-centered psychotherapies. And in my practice in Nashville, I'm in private practice. I provide supervision for pre-licensed marriage and family therapists, and work mostly with Black, Indigenous people of color, and gender and sexual minorities. And yeah. Good to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Ms. Senge. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. And so last but not least, I want to introduce Dave Talamo. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. He is the founder of Wilderness Reflections that I have been a fan of for a long time here in the Bay Area. And I've admired his work, the breadth and depth of his work. And I'm so excited and grateful that he had the time to join us today. Dave.
Thank you, Phoenix. Yeah, really just kudos to you for what you're doing and for hosting this event, and grateful to get to participate. I'm a somewhat olive-skinned white person in a blue shirt here, and I'm speaking to you from Satako, known as the San Geronimo Valley, now indigenous ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people. And kind of overlapping the stories you've heard, for me, I was always a kid who wanted to be outside. And when I was 13 years old, had the great privilege to go to a wilderness camp up in Maine. And right there, canoeing out on Junior Lake someday in the summer. It's a little hard to explain, but it's like a trap door opened and I fell through it, and in that moment felt safe and at home in a way I never knew was possible before then. And I'd spent many of the years prior to that outdoors whenever I could be there, but something shifted and I basically jumped through that doorway as fast as I could and led kind of a dual life through the rest of middle school and high school, of in town, suburbs, in the school years doing that thing, and then in the summer disappearing into the wilderness in Maine. And that carried on for a while through college and beyond. And I got to guide river trips and other things all around the US and other countries even. Was really grateful to do that, but something was always missing for me and I couldn't quite figure it out. And I saw that there was this transformation that happens sometimes in the wilderness. And I said, that's what I want to do. I don't want to just have that be a occasional byproduct of what we're doing. So I went looking for a form in which to do that work and worked for Outward Bound. And eventually that led me back to graduate school, CIS in the Bay Area. And during that time, I got exposed to the work of Stephen Foster and Meredith Little and the Wilderness Rites of Passage work, and found that as a deep calling, and never really being sure if I'd even get licensed as a therapist. And somewhere after finishing my master's degree, I was out on a wilderness fast myself and alone in the desert, and had this moment with a bighorn sheep. And in that moment, just got the message, oh, you need to get licensed, which is not really what I wanted to do at that point. And several years later, finally went down that path, and kind of all the way since have been blending and blurring the lines between wilderness guiding and wilderness work and therapy and therapeutic work. At this point, I've been licensed for about 20 years as a therapist and been a wilderness guide for a little over 40 years. So just grateful to see the work evolving and the new things that are being brought to it. And really, I'm here as much to learn as to offer anything. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to point out that asking the panelists to share their Earth story is a common technique that we use in ecotherapy. And I have found it to be very powerful when people share that even among the differences among the panelists, you can see that each of them had their own unique but similar experience in connecting and deepening their connection with the natural world that led them to this work. So thank you for that. So for the community here, so I'm going to ask them questions and each panelist will answer. We ask that if you have any questions of them, you either hold them to the end and or you can put them in the chat as well. So just so people know how the flow is going to go today. So I'm going to start with the first question. And some of you already touched upon this a little bit, but I would ask that you go a little deeper with this. Ecotherapy is practiced in many different ways As Dr. Hicks said, he didn't even really use the term ecotherapy in his work. So I'm curious. So the first question for each panelist, we'll start with Dr. Hicks, is how do you practice ecotherapy?
The way I practice ecotherapy, I think I mentioned briefly in my introduction, is by combining my clinical training as a psychotherapist with outdoor rock climbing. So what that looks like is, I don't know how many of you have been to San Francisco, but it's kind of a magical place in the sense that the parks in San Francisco, when you're in them, it doesn't feel like you're in a major city in America. And I found this wonderful little park called Glen Canyon Park that happened to have some outdoor rock climbing rocks that fit my purpose. And I really wanted to focus on children in pre-adolescence, that age where children are transitioning from a latency age into pre-adolescence, into adolescence, somewhere between 9 and 16. Because I feel like that's a critical developmental stage, because the children I work with are revisiting the adverse childhood experiences and the trauma that they have incurred in a way that is rich for therapy. And so I meet the young people out there, the urban youth. I provide all of the gear, the helmets, the harnesses, the climbing shoes, the ropes. And we take each step at a time to engage in this interaction to treat trauma and adverse experiences. My understanding that the cure for trauma is actually in developing secure attachments in relationships with others. And you have to do that if you're rock climbing.
Thank you so much. Musenge, how do you practice ecotherapy?
Both indoors and outdoors, mostly in natural parks, national parks. And so a session indoors could look like using my basket full of nature beings, feathers and acorns and other nature beings I've foraged and were gifted to me on my hikes, or a visualization. And I use Hakomi to immerse people in some of their memories of nature from childhood in our sessions. And when they're ready to go outside, I have a backyard that I use sometimes if we need to go outside and we didn't plan on going outside. And I have some of my favorite trails that I know very intimately that I share. And so the first modality was Hakomi, and just want to name that was appropriated by Hopi people. It means, who are you? And it's a somatic body-centered psychotherapy. And I support my clients in really getting to their core material through their body, their fascia, and doing that in a natural environment provides this container of safety, and it's very regulating and enables them to do that actually a lot faster, in my experience. And so they get to have this simultaneous connection with their internal environment and their external environment with Hakomi. And then I also use internal family therapy, IFS, which is a therapy that states that we all have these sub-personalities that were developed as a response to trauma and challenges in our lifetime, and also in our ancestry as well. So they protect us from pain and suffering and can also hold us in behavioral patterns that don't serve us or even disconnect us from ourselves and others. So I use this modality a lot, along with like ritual, to support people in unburdening some of these parts of ourselves that have been stuck. And a lot of them are ancestral as well. So lots of rituals in nature and unburdening. And I also use brain spotting outdoors, which is similar to EMDR, but it's a trauma-based therapy that kind of postulates where you look affects how you feel. So there's lots of different places in nature that you can look, and we use any area where their eyes land to process whatever feelings and emotions come up around that. And then once again, nature is this beautiful container to hold the space and provide safety while processing some traumatic material. And also serves as a co-therapist for me, so I don't ever feel really alone when I'm working with clients, and lots of different very painful experiences come around. So it also regulates me as a therapist.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mwanafunzi. Dave, how do you practice ecotherapy?
A lot of what she said. I'm strongly influenced by Hakomi and weave that in. I'm working indoors and outdoors with individuals, with groups, with families, primarily. Also weaving in a bunch of somatic experiencing, that approach to trauma healing of Peter Levine's, and then weaving in with that the wilderness rites of passage work and that ceremonial approach to creating a threshold and stepping into something with intention. Sessions that I do could be anywhere from an hour to a week long, depending on the situation, individual or group or what have you. Again, settings indoor, kind of near nature, as one of my students calls it, like city or suburban parks, and then out to wilder, all the way out to wilderness areas. One of the things I'm consciously holding, especially when I'm outdoors with someone, is we really like to think about there being two attachment systems. One's kind of the human attachment that psychology talks about the most, and the other, what's a person's, what I call foundational attachment or nature attachment, like how's their sense of belonging here on this planet with this dirt, these plants, this air, and kind of really trying to keep both of those or weave both of those together as we go. I'm also fond of really keeping some of my attention, not just to track my clients, but what's happening in the field that we're in, and that there are these, we call them synchronous nature events that come in and offer something that I could never have dreamed up. And so that's a beautiful part of working ecotherapeutically for me. Yeah, that's a good place to pause.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for just sharing practical information on how you practice ecotherapy. And as we can see, there's no one way. There's a diversity of practices, and you can practice ecotherapy inside, and that it can be very effective as well. I'm going to move on to the next question. And we'll start with Dr. Hicks again. How do you think issues around social justice, for example, honoring and supporting Indigenous communities, racial ethnic diversity of ecotherapists and clients, access and equity can be or needs to be integrated within the fields of ecotherapy and ecopsychology? And I want to say what I sent to the panelists, and I'm saying to the community as well, that don't worry about answering all the social justice questions. Like, there's no pressure here to answer things perfectly. Frequently now, there's a lot of pressure on the interwebs to be like the most woke person in the world. That's not what we're doing here. And that's why we use the term dialogues. If we're going to get to any understanding, we need to listen and share with each other. So I want to put that out to the panelists and to the community, as well as we all agreed that we took the invitation into Brave Space. So Dr. Hicks, please go forth.
Sure. Well, I think a previous conversation in this conference, we kind of talked about the reality that open space has been denied to people of color in this country, in the United States. And I work primarily with children of color. And one of the messages I like to convey when we're out in the open space rock climbing is that this space belongs to you too, that you have free and equal access to enjoy what we're doing here today anytime you want. Because the message that we get as people of color is that we don't belong in these spaces. And so I really make a conscious effort to message that yes, you do, that this belongs to you too, and you are free to enjoy this space just as much as anyone else.
Thank you so much. Musengi.
I think because of the populations that I work with, Black, Indigenous people of color, and gender and sexual minorities, issues around social justice comes up in my work most of the time. So as we're practicing ecotherapy, like Dr. Hicks commented, there's this question about feeling welcome in these, white spaces and feeling safe as well. That is also an issue that I come across quite a bit. And then we start to look at, the environments that we grew up in and that we live in and how they tend to be more polluted and not have as many green spaces, and processing that and how that's impacted their mental health and physical health and spiritual health. So that definitely comes up. And advocacy. And I always use myself as an example. I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood. It's historically Black, where a lot of the HBCU faculty and staff have been living for years. And it's a beautiful space. And we're constantly going to council meetings trying to prevent this landfill that is from a very wealthy county from being placed in our neighborhood. We already have one, and the smell when it rains is putrid and nauseating, and they want to put in another one. And these are the things that we're able to talk about that happen in our communities through my work in ecotherapy.
Thank you so much, Musengi. Dave.
Yeah, I think, I'm working in a largely different demographic, a lot of European white clients and students, and really it feels like some of our most useful traction is really just being transparent and saying, hey, look, this is all what's going on. We're figuring it out. This is a little of what we're starting to do, but kind of bumping into some of the uncomfortable places of what's our role, what's our responsibility as people who've been descended from the settlers. And it's honestly, it's awkward, probably more often than it's not, conversations and trying to find something of a sweet spot or sweeter spot of how to really bring that forward when we're out on the land, say with a group, and we're talking about whose land is this, whose land has it been, and what do we do with that? And we're really just on the learning curve with people in that. There's efforts being made to extend scholarships to people who have less access to this work. We have some of that going. There's also, in terms of gender diversity, there's a learning curve there. And just even the simple step of helping people be addressed in the way they want to be addressed with the pronouns they want to be addressed by. That's a learning curve that lots of us are on. Yeah, lots more I could say, but that's some of the kind of the top of the obvious pile for us.
Thank you, all of you. What I'm hearing is, some of the issues around not feeling safe by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, not feeling like you belong. Also issues of environmental justice and advocacy. Musenge talked about how she's involved in her community, in her neighborhood, in local advocacy, as am I, as I also live in a neighborhood that is severely impacted by environmental toxins. I'm also hearing that, just as Dave said, even working with predominantly white people, it's uncomfortable for them to have the conversations, but starting off by talking about whose land they're on is a great opening, entry point. In addition, trying to raise people's consciousness around gender and gender identity, et cetera. So there's lots of intersectional issues here. But at the root of it, what I'm hearing is really everyone just wanting to find a place where they feel safe and belong out in the natural world, no matter their station in life, no matter their race or their gender. I thank you for having the courage to even answer that question, because some people are scared to even talk about it. So thank you for that. Next, I want to move into a question around, there's a lot of research, every day, and Linda Bazell, who is on this call, who's on this, tracks a lot of the research that talks about how nature is good for you, how 15 minutes a day, and I see we might have an MD here, Dr. Farahi, MD. And sometimes there's like a medicalization of nature and prescriptions, and there's lots and lots of research, although I have not seen any that looks at specific populations, meaning racial and ethnic diversity around people. And it's hard to pinpoint what type of ecotherapy or nature-based interventions help for different conditions, right? So I've asked the panelists to answer the question, how have you seen ecotherapy help reduce symptoms of trauma, anxiety, isolation, and or depression in clients? And if you want to share a brief case study, that is fine. So Dr. Hicks, we'll start with you.
Yeah, great question. I think anybody who is a researcher, is interested in researching, doing research, the question you have to define, right? First of all, what's going on, who does it benefit, and how? I had the good fortune of actually doing my research and on psychotherapy and rock climbing. And of course, the question I asked was, is which cultural group does rock climbing in the therapeutic sense benefit the most? And so I controlled for ethnicity. And what I found in my research is that overall general functioning improved for all of the participants in the study. But as you started to go through, well, in what ways, something emerged that was surprising. So if you're research, you really like surprises, because then you start scratching your head and coming up with an explanation. And what I found was that relative to functioning at home, in school, in community, the global sense, everyone did well. Everybody improved their functioning globally. But when I broke it down, and you mentioned depression, Phoenix, what I found is that African American participants, Black children, actually did better with depression. But in other areas of functioning, they were much lower than their cultural counterparts. So I had to say, well, why, even though, actually, let me correct myself. Actually, their overall general functioning for Black children actually decreased relative to their cultural counterparts, that increased. And so even though depression was alleviated through the rock climbing study, I was scratching my head wondering, well, why overall functioning was so low. And what I concluded is that no one treatment modality is enough to address the ongoing complex trauma and adverse childhood experiences in Black children and youth in urban environments. That we actually have to put together a series of interventions over time, because these traumas and adverse experiences continue to happen to our Black children over and over and over. Racial trauma just happens to be the one that is always present, but as you mentioned earlier too, Phoenix, the community violence is ongoing, right? The continuous grieving process because of sudden loss, right? These are the conditions under which Black communities, communities of color suffer the most. So that's what I'll add to that question.
Thank you so much. Usenge.
I think over the past 10 years, I have seen a lot of reduction in symptoms of depression and anxiety just after a few sessions, as we tend to usually close an ecotherapy session with, okay, how are you going to bring what was offered here today into your regular life? And so there's this continuation of whatever practices that they came up or that were offered to them. One client in particular, struggling with OCD around death and dying, and as a result was isolated, didn't really come out of the house that much, really benefited. And I want to honor their story. I recognize that I'm very protective over my clients' stories. So I want to share what happened without sharing what happened. But he belongs to several marginalized groups, and immediately noticed that he felt very welcome in the space. As we were doing a meditation, a sweet little squirrel came up to him and greeted him. And that was a sign that he took as I belong here, I can take up space here. And just in seeing some decaying vegetation, nourishing some new trees, some very young trees, he was able to talk about death and dying in a way that was comfortable for him, which was a big step. Even though he does not continue along the trail that we went, most of my clients continue to visit the trails that we visited during ecotherapy sessions. They go back over and over and over again, but he won't go without me. But he does still enjoy the outdoors from the safety of his porch, and drinks tea and has some quiet time. And what's resulted from that is going from not really been able to enter the workforce, never employed, to having a job that he really enjoys, working out in nature.
Oh, that was a powerful share. Thank you so much. Thank you. Dave.
Yeah, I want to just stitch in too. I think one of the strongest things that interweaves with the social justice piece for clients is that, to me, doing ecotherapy, there's a reciprocity, there's a giving back, there's a relationship that's what's bigger than us. And there's so much disorientation, I would say, in our society in believing that we're separate from nature, and that simple act of giving back in some way and acknowledging there are others than human here whose lives matter, whose existing, is something to give gratitude for. And anyway, I just wanted to name that piece in it. And when I think about a case study, one that comes to mind, a woman who was, midlife, say 40 years old, and dealing with a lot of trauma that had been plaguing her from childhood, sexual abuse, molestation, repeated, not protected by anyone in her family, from several family members. And there was a certain piece where healing was happening indoors, but it was kind of getting stuck. And when we finally got her outdoors, for her, it was the simple fact of having space to let her anger out and not have the four walls, or who's going to hear me, or what am I going to hurt by doing whatever. And just for her to pick up and throw some things off of a hilltop in, a semi-urban park area where no one was around. That was such a shift for her in the process of therapy. And she went on to develop a lot more close relationships. She ended up taking on a foster son for a number of years and doing things she would never have thought possible. And I kind of credit that space for her to be able to let the bigness of her feelings out somewhere as having a huge impact on the journey. So that sense of space, there's so many ways you can work with that outdoors you don't get to when you're inside.
Thank you, all of you, for sharing that, and for Dr. Hicks for giving us information about your actual resource, and speaking to the fact that you found for Black children, it's not one particular modality like rock climbing that can address what they need, what our children need. And Musenge sharing around your client being able to connect and feel a sense of belonging as you worked with them in nature, to the point where now that they can take care of themselves and have employment. And then Dave just sharing around how a client with, lots of trauma from sexual abuse and having the ability to release some of the strong emotions out into the natural world beyond the confines of a very clinical office. Therapist's office are also very clean and sterile, right? At least when I've gone to my therapist, it's always a nice, clean, and may have, a snake plant there and some music, but it's designed to be a very clean and space. And when you have big feelings around trauma, I understand her not feeling comfortable to be able to just yell them or do whatever she needed to do, and how nature can provide that safe container. So I appreciate all of you for sharing with us the different ways that connecting with nature with your clients in ecotherapy can specifically address different types of trauma, but also that it's not a panacea. And it's specifically, I find there's a tendency now in the literature and in media to want to just put everything into nature. Oh, well, if you do this with nature, it can cure this and cure that. And I think that takes us back to a way of thinking of the world, like there's one way to do something. And that's not the case. So thank you all for that. And then the last question that I have for them is, if you can just share with us, starting with Dr. Hicks, name one or two challenges that you've had in doing your work.
Just one or two?
Yeah, whatever you want to share, man.
Yeah, thanks. I think the biggest challenge is getting more urban youth out in the open space, in rock climbing, and what the other presenters are doing, and those before us and those who come after us are trying to do. It's not considered, I don't think yet, standard practice modality, but I do see that there's a growing space for this to be accepted, in a larger therapeutic space moving forward.
Thank you. Musenge, what one or two challenges have you experienced in practicing ecotherapy?
Finding safe spaces is a challenge. There's a lot of monuments for Confederate soldiers here in the South, and we tend to always run into a plaque or a statue along the way, or even the park that I go to it has completely missed out a piece of history where they said that the Scottish were the first people on this land where the park is. And so there's a lot of that that I come across, and just finding literature by Black, Indigenous people of color that practice ecotherapy has not been as easy as finding other literature. So that's our two challenges.
Thank you. And Dave, what do you come across in challenges?
Yeah. I think safe spaces, but in a different way than Masenge is speaking about it, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time with a certain person. Some of that being predictable and some of it not. Just being, I remember going somewhere once to meet a client, and there was the whole park was closed for some event I had no idea about. Like just that kind of, there's human activities or environmental, changes that certainly changed the ability to do whatever I think we're there to do. Hordes of mountain bikers coming by when you're near a trail trying to have a moment. And I think another challenge more in this realm too for me is keeping the work accessible financially while affording to live in a place that's not so affordable. Just that kind of balance. Those are a few that come to mind.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Yes, I have found that just when you go out to scout locations or you go to different places, it can be challenging to find a space that feels comfortable. And I can only imagine, I grew up in Texas, so I know about seeing landmarks for, white supremacy everywhere you go, which doesn't always invoke safety, but can invoke a good conversation, right? Around why is this here? What is this about? Unpacking that. I definitely understand that. I want to get to some questions now. We have a few questions that were in the chat, and I'm going to start with Craig Patterson had a question. I'm just going to read it out, and whoever wants to address it, jump in. How would you relate to the intersection of eco-psychology and the collective unconsciousness that Jung speaks of? How would you relate to the intersection of eco-psychology and the collective unconsciousness that Jung speaks of? If there's anyone that's a pretty big question, wants to jump in to answer that.
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer. I'm not a Jungian by trade, so it sounds like a beautiful question, though.
So that's your answer, Dr. Hicks. It is a beautiful question.
That's just a comment. It's not my area of expertise.
I'll say something not particularly my area of expertise as well, but I know in some of the quest traditions that I've trained in, there's a sense that when we get into a deep nature connection, we're kind of listening to the same thing, and that whatever comes, even if I'm making an individual journey alone, it might be about me and my life in some way, but there's always something larger coming through. And I guess where that comes up the most in my mind is in those kinds of journeys, or the dreams that come into people's awareness when they're out on the land for days and nights at a time, and there's that kind of deep immersion and just sense of I have no idea what's going to come, even if someone says, yeah, this is my intention and here's an itinerary for what we're going to do, but what's going to emerge from them definitely feels like it's coming from somewhere wild, sort of with a capital W, beyond what my mind and even their minds can expect.
Thank you for that. You know, something that's always been curious for me, because there are a lot of Jungians that are eco-psychologists and the collective unconscious. I'm always like, do they just dream about white people all the time? I mean, I'm serious, because in this field for me, I'm like, you can talk about the collective unconsciousness and go deep, but then you can't even talk about your own race. You can't even talk about the fact that why is it just white people? Why is it majority white people that are still doing this work? That's why the Alliance was created, because there's a huge gap here. That it's talked about as a universal experience, because Jung said it's a universal, but universal to who? Most people I know, they're Black, they don't know anything about Jung, and they don't care. But the way that the textbooks are written and the training programs and these graduate programs, it's always talked about like it's a universal, because he said this, it's a universal experience. And my question, which is something that, Linda, help me out, my mind is blanking. Carl, Ecotherapy, that was in the only Black person in the first eco-psychology book he talked about. Carl Anthony is like, this real gap within eco-psychologists. They can go real deep about their relationship with the tree and the river and the collective unconsciousness. But when you ask them about social justice or race, they get a blank face. So I'm going to throw that question back out there. It's not for anyone to answer. When they're talking about collective unconsciousness, who's unconscious? Is it just white people's, European people? Because to me, it feels that way. I don't relate to that at all. And I think that's a big problem in the field and the way that they're teaching eco-psychology and ecotherapy. It lacks any kind of analysis around race or gender or social justice. And it bothers me, as you can tell, because it's said over and over and over and over and over again. Musanga, did you want to say something or no? Okay. So another question is, can anyone address the disconnects and separation that our affluence has created? That's one question. And then also how privilege, white, economic, or other, has perpetuated this separation. I'll read it again. Can anyone address the disconnects and separation that our affluence has created?
Yeah, well, I think you're talking about it. You know, affluence is highly correlated with ethnicity. The statistics are pretty clear about that. And you know, as the affluence gap expands, the privilege gain more power, and then they make more decisions about how the rest of us should live. And the higher the income, the lighter the complexion tends to go. So we have this cycle, but there's always been a wealth gap for people of color and for white people in America, right? And when we start to make gains as people of color, economically, politically, socially, there's always a big pushback to say, you know, that we're not going to have that. So I think it's an issue that needs to be sort of mentioned and brought to our consciousness, because that would be the only way to say, oh, well, maybe there's something more going on here than what I thought.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was a little distracted. My dog came home from his dog walk. Come here, Wizard. And so here he is. He needed my attention. So I apologize for that. I'm going to open it up for questions from the community. You can unmute yourself. And if anyone has questions, please, or comments, please share.
I'm a 80-year-old European and Jewish extraction. I'm from Minneapolis. I live a few blocks from where George Floyd was killed. and I'm on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. And my question has to do with the pushback from white people about any kind of social change, that anything that changes the dynamic that we have now. There seems to be, as soon as you mention it, there's pushback, and what can we do about that? Because right now that seems to be the problem. I worked in the past a lot with people of color, and now I'm trying to work with white people, and it's a lot. They both have their frustrations, but that's the frustration that I'm having right now.
I'll ask Dave, since he is our white therapist here, if he could speak to that.
Yeah, if I got the question right, you know, I know I have a client or two who've initiated this conversation with me, and really, I feel like as a white person, I have a certain voice that they're going to hear that they won't hear from someone who doesn't look like them quite exactly. And I don't feel like I have the answers, but I find myself trying to be graceful, and at the same time, sometimes boiling over with just, you know, get a clue. Like, how much more privileged do you have to be than to be one of the wealthiest people in the history of humanity, and that we're standing in the blood and whatever of the people who've gone before us. And yeah, you personally didn't do that. I get it. And you're living in the harvest of that. And so I don't feel like I have the answers, but I go somewhere between almost outrage and gentleness and motivational interviewing, or, you know, my general approach to any of this is just, what do I possibly know that might be of use? And I'll pull that in if I think it's going to serve. So, but I guess the thing I would say is to not necessarily always be quite as politic or polite as many therapists might be. And there's a, you know, in my role as therapist is different than my role as friend or community member, and somewhat of a delicate dance, but that's some of my thoughts off the top.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Janet, for all of your work and being an elder in this work and continuing to do your work. I want to just say I appreciate you. And I want to comment on that, as I'm also an ecotherapist, and I work with people primarily in my role as a spiritual leader. And I do divination and work with people of all races, even though this is an African-based tradition. I've had many white clients, and a consistent theme, no matter the race of the people, is what something that Musenge brought up, is a need for ancestral healing. An ancestor comes out to speak to them, to tell them to do something, to tell them to change something. And that usually happens with everyone, no matter what their race, when they come in. Even for myself, when I started on this path, one of the first readings that I got was that my ancestors were calling me to clean up a lot of mess that was passed down in my family, intergenerational trauma. The message wasn't that you need to go blame white people. That wasn't the message from spirit. The message was that I had to take responsibility for my own blood lineage and tell the truth about what had happened to my family, because it still lives in there. What I see from working with my white clients and having white people in my family is it is an ancestral issue. White supremacy has traumatized white people tremendously. And there's a real serious denial around the impacts of that. Why did white people come to this land? What were they fleeing? Resma talks about this in My Grandmother's Hands, right? The Black male therapist based in Minneapolis, that white people need to create a culture for themselves. But the denial around how did your people come to this place if it's the United States? and the trauma that their ancestors experienced, that there's a deep denial that I find among white people. I find among other people of color that just the trauma of white supremacy has wounded them so bad as well, but it comes from different angles. And so I go deeper with that with white people and with all my clients around unpacking your ancestral history. Not just like, okay, my parent came from here, but like you do in family systems therapy. Where did the depression come from in your family? What was the root of that? The suicidal ideations. Where did the wealth come from? Right? Like I find that there's a denial among white people how white supremacy does not serve them in any way. It actually makes them more like children deep down inside and very reactionary. I'm reading James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. I've never read that book. And it's only like, it's less than 100 pages. I highly recommend you read it. You can read it like that, but it's very deep. He's preaching, it's a meditation. And people like to frequently put on social media his quote where he says, to be a Black person in America all the time, you're full of rage. That was one thing he said, but he also said, and it's on the back of the book, that if we are going to be able to really create a country of peace and harmony, and he was just referring to, he says, Black and white people, that we need to learn how to really tell the truth and be in connection with each other. That's another thing that James Baldwin said in The Fire Next Time, right? And that really struck me, right? Frequently, and sometimes for Black and Indigenous people, we get stuck in our trauma and we get stuck as victims because it doesn't stop. It just keeps coming. You might feel there's no recovery from this. There's no recovery. When people say we're training so you can recover from trauma and racism, it happens every day, all the time. So you don't even have a moment to rest. And so that, for myself, I have found nature is a place where I've been able to tap into rest, right? Into being able to rest. But I find that white people are seriously wounded by white supremacy. And until they can get real about that and about, I'm not talking about anybody else, but their own family blood lineages, it will continue to repeat the same things over and over again. For example, anytime we see a mass shooter in the United States, and frequently they're white boys, do you ever hear a national initiative to help white boys deal with their violence? No, they just isolate the one white boy or one white man and say that, mental illness, but they don't talk about white culture that led this white male. But if you talk about Black boys, it's always about our culture is violent. We got to do some national initiative. And that really wounds white people. That wounds white boys and white men. So this is what I have found in my work when working with white people, that it goes all the time, it goes back to our ancestors. So that's my comment. Craig Patterson, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for that. And as a white person who was involved with civil rights as early as '63, because I grew up in San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to an experimental college that the sophomore class went to India at 18, 19 years old. And yet, I'm finding myself alienated from even the people I went to college with, because they cannot see the depths of the white privilege that is so pervasive. And when I try to bring it up, then I'm the problem, because they cannot accept it. But it is so endemic in our society. And one place where I'm working currently is in energy and energy conservation. I'm not a therapist. I gave up psychology when they wanted to teach me about rats and Skinner boxes instead of Eastern philosophy and humanistic psychology. But in terms of energy, even the conservation programs are social engineering in reverse. And I try to bring this up and give examples, and they don't want to listen to it. So I think that what white people have to realize is that it does a disservice to everyone to be blinded by privilege. And that how do we overcome that is a question that I've thought about, and I don't have the answers, but I keep pushing.
Thank you so much, Craig. I just want to give thanks to the two white elders that have spoken. I appreciate you showing up here and speaking up. Does anyone else have a comment or question?
I do. I have a question.
Go ahead.
My name is John Harris. I reside in New York City. I go by the pronoun he, him, and I have a question. Do any of the panelists know anything about neuro-linguistic programming? And if they do they practice it? And do they use it in their therapy sessions? And what are their thoughts about NLP?
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I have a disclosure. John Harris and I are very good friends, dating back to our college years. Thanks for joining. I appreciate you. You know I don't practice like that, but I hope some of our other panelists or even guests may be able to answer your question.
Phoenix, this is Marguerite Dunn. I would like to say something. You guys can't see me, but I'll describe a little bit about my background. My mother was from Hungary and my father was Puerto Rico. I grew up in a Black housing project in New York City. So I kind of feel like I've always had something for everybody. And it was very interesting to me. By the time I was 7 years old, I could clock the differences between the white people I was related to and the Hispanic people I was related to and the African-American community I was growing up in. So in many ways, my background had a lot of challenges, but at this point in my life, I'm thrilled that I've gotten the benefits of being a mixed race person, a multicultural person from the very beginning of my life. Also, if anybody had told me when I was a little girl growing up in the projects that I was going to be a clinical medicinal herbalist here at the end of my life, I would have said, you're kidding me. But anyway, and I found my way to this position because, you know, on the screen, it says my last name is Dunn. That's a married name. My maiden name was Cortez, actually. So when I was 18 years old, I went to the Margaret Sanger Clinic. They and the high school I went to happened to be predominantly white, and a couple of my white girlfriends had gone to the Margaret Sanger Clinic to get birth control pills. So I went there, and all my white girlfriends were allowed to choose this other pill, but they said to me that I had to take this one specific birth control pill. They just yelled at me, and being an 18-year-old girl, I didn't know how to own my own space. Long story short, the birth control pills nearly killed me. And I got all kinds of health problems. And I went to 9 different doctors who kept pumping me with more drugs. Nothing helped after close to 4 years. Karmically, a friend of mine introduced me to medicinal herbs. And within 2 weeks, my body was healed. So I've never looked back. I've been a clinical herbalist since then. And I've been going into nature and loving nature and having it heal me for many, many reasons. I love the way you have gone back and forth saying the first message you got in your divination was clean up your own ancestral tree, and that we each do have to look at what's going on in our backgrounds. And it's been interesting because I've always felt the word my spirit guide sent me years ago was bridge. I've been translating white people to inner city people, and I've been translating inner city people of color to white people. And that's been going on a lot in my life. And some consciousness has been raised within the last few years about white supremacy. And you said this was a safe space. I want to, and you're right, one of the things that really is not okay is all these mass shooters do happen to be white boys. What is going on in that white culture? And that's a problem for the white boys. Likewise, the problems are for the inner city young men of color. But also, there have been the inner city people themselves who have not acknowledged the value of healing in nature, and have made it difficult for other people to leave the inner city. And while we're here today and everybody in this group seems to be of a higher consciousness and everybody here celebrates the value of being in nature, that's something that we have to look at too. Right now, I'm in the process of trying to create, I'm working with community gardens in the inner city right now, and I want to do a healing clinic for inner city women. And my experience has been when I do herbal workshops for inner city women, they love it. They run so fast in that direction, and I want to get the word out. So if anybody has any suggestions on helping me get the word out in my community a little bit faster and how to, transform that, I'd appreciate it. But we're putting everything into this jambalaya mixture right now, and I think that that's part of it too. So thank you. I am so grateful for being here today, and I'm so grateful for sharing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. One of the things that I have found on my path as an ecotherapist is that some of the most powerful ecotherapy projects are led by people that are not licensed therapists at all. So for example, here in my community, talking about urban gardens, Kelly from Acta Non-Verba that started a garden in the middle of East Oakland that I used to volunteer at, works with young youth of color, and several initiatives all over the country that are growing in Black and Indigenous communities of color, some who live in an urban city, some who live in rural areas, are doing more farming. There's more consciousness around farming. There's more consciousness around growing our own food and medicinal herbs. And as we saw during the pandemic, and I've been part of mutual aid groups here that for some people in our community, that's where we were able to support each other. The garden became a focal place where you could gather safely. And I found that anytime in the ecotherapy trainings I've done, and I get a lot of therapists that come to me for divination because they, after all their practice, their years of study, they know that there's a limit to Western psychotherapy. They hit a wall and they're looking for some spiritual guidance. I get a lot of therapists, and it's the same thing that when we start talking about our relationship to the earth or plants, I've had people just start crying, men and women, they just break down. It opens up something really deep inside people, and they always talk about their ancestors or their elders, and that's what leads them into that opening. I see Monica with her hand. Monica, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Monica. I live on Kirkin Ohlone land, which is called by settler colonizers El Sobrani in the East Bay of San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a white genderqueer person with red hair, shaved in a curly mohawk kind of thing. And I wanted to ask especially Dr. Hicks and Musenge about more, what are the kind of healing messages or works, especially across culture and across differences, that that we can bring as healers or therapists to folk? I heard helping people reclaim and also making the space safer for especially BIPOC folks around, like, you belong here, you get to take up space here, or nature as a place of rest and safety, feeling welcome, belonging, processing how a lack of nature impacts their well-being and mental health, and also bringing in the advocacy and the social justice work. And just curious if there are other pieces. Would love to learn from you, and or authors you like, places to learn more. Yeah, thank you.
Musenge, do you want to go first?
I was gonna say, please go ahead. I'll go. I need to think about it just for a moment.
Okay, sure. So I think generally the outdoor space is sort of an equalizer across differences. We're all in the same place, the same space, bring ourselves to whatever the ideas or tasks are before us and challenges. And I think it's through that experience that the participants begin to realize that those things that they held on to as differences aren't really that important. What is important is our experience and what we share with the other in these moments. I know when I take young people out rock climbing, there's a recognition that despite our differences, we got to work together here. If we're going to do this safely, we have to learn not only how to take care of ourselves and keep ourselves safe, but we also need to figure out how to keep the other person safe, particularly if you're belaying or engaged in support in some way. And so over time, at least it's been my experience with young people, over time that whatever your gender identification is, whatever your physicality is, whatever your mental health challenges are, learning disabilities, whatever, it doesn't matter. And what I see, particularly with those youth who have trouble with relationships and are often awkward or confrontational or can't form relationships, that they can do that under the structure of ecotherapy, and certainly in my role, taking young people outdoor rock climbing.
Thank you. Musenge, do you have anything you want to add?
Actually, love this book. It's called Undrowned: Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Animals. Wonderful book. Highly recommend it. Some of the ways I support my clients, I've actually connected probably 3 or 4 clients with outdoor Afro. I see a lot of students locally, and when they go back home or go to another school, that's a place that they can feel safe and continue to do their work. Also incorporate music, dance, ritual into the ecotherapy, and other expressive arts, poetry, and storytelling, which is really important, and healing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Musenge. Yes, I also have that book, Undrowned. I highly recommend it as well. We are about towards the end of our dialogue today. I just want to thank everyone. Thank Dave, thank Dr. Hicks, thank Musenge for your courage and your patience and your flexibility with us, and your wisdom and knowledge for coming here today and, sticking your foot into this first of many conversations around ecotherapy and social justice. How can we make this more equitable and accessible, and have challenging conversations in a mutually respectful and humble way with each other? And I'm very, very grateful to you. I also want to ask that, the Alliance is a project that I'm doing on top of a full-time job in public health. I don't do this work full-time. And if we would be very grateful if you could donate to this work. The panelists have donated their time. They are not getting compensated from this. The volunteers have donated their time. They are not getting compensated monetarily for this. So any donation that you can give us, we would greatly appreciate it. I also want to just, I got to shout out one of my advisory council members, Linda, who's so supportive and showed up today. Thank you so much. And thank you for those of you, the 2 elders that spoke up today, Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for the elders in my life and very grateful for all your living and wisdom that you were able to come here today and share with us as well. Thanks to Alicia, the tech assistant, and all the volunteers. And just thank you all for your time.